Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 10, August to September, 1931.
With their usual enterprise, the Japanese, in the expectation that American warships would use the Cape Horn route, had prepared an ambush there. 2 submarines had been lying in concealment for an uncertain period in the Beagle Channel, a remote strait separating Tierra del Fuego from Navarin and Hoste Islands. Some 120 miles in length, with an average breadth of about 2 miles, this channel is almost perfectly straight for the greater part of its course, which runs nearly due east and west. Bounded on either shore by mountains and cliffs, it is one of the most remarkable features of this wild region. Here was an ideal hiding place for submarines, for the strait is seldom visited by ships and has near its middle an independent exit known as Ponsonby Sound, leading southward to the open sea near Cape Horn. The exact spot in which the submarines I-58 and I-53 established their temporary base is uncertain, as there are many small coves on both sides of the Beagle Channel. It is known, however, that they occasionally shifted from Chilean to Argentine waters and back again, with the object of confusing the issue should awkward questions arise in connection with their infringement of neutrality. It should be noted that the boundary between Chile and Argentina, after cutting across Tierra del Fuego from north to south, turns somewhat abruptly to the eastward on reaching the Beagle Channel, and thence runs in a line with its course, so that all the islands to the south of Tierra del Fuego are Chilean territory. On August 7th, the American fleet passed Cape Virgins and entered the Straits of Magellan. Reference to the accompanying sketch map will elucidate the events that followed. For about the first 100 miles of their course from the Atlantic, the shores of the straits are comparatively level, but from a point a little beyond the second narrows, they become rugged and hilly, until both sides are hedged with mountains, densely wooded, and often snow-capped. Here and there, the landscape is diversified by the appearance of a glacier, though at certain seasons mist and rain render it difficult to pick out anything distinctly. The scenery when visible is magnificent, and the shore can be approached closely in most parts, the water, though remarkably clear, being very deep right up to the base of the cliffs. A conspicuous feature of the heights when closely approached is the gigantic tree fuchsia, which flourishes everywhere. Just within the second narrows, on the northern shore, is situated the southernmost town of the Republic of Chile, Punta Arenas, Sandy Point. This isolated port is well furnished with piers, quays, cranes, and all the normal accessories of a coaling station, but there are no docks. It is practically the only settlement of any size on the straits, which elsewhere are but very sparsely populated, the climate being damp in summer and severe in winter. It will be noticed from the map that innumerable channels, bays, and inlets open off the straits between Punta Arenas and the Pacific, offering a fine choice of routes, but also providing many opportunities for an ambush. Of the several alternative courses which can be followed to reach the Pacific from Punta Arenas, the 3 principal ones are A. Straight out into the Pacific through Cockburn Channel. B. To the termination of the Magellan Straits proper, passing into the Pacific by the channel leading between Queen Charlotte Island to the north and Desolation Island to the south. C. Right through the continuation of the straits, known as Smythe Channel, this being the route followed by the majority of merchant steamers. In its passage through the straits, the fleet preserved the same general formation as throughout its voyage. Under this arrangement, destroyers and minesweepers took the lead, followed by the heavy ships, each division of which was accompanied by more light craft. The aircraft carriers Wright and Lexington were stationed in the van and rear respectively, and the various auxiliaries distributed between the several divisions of the fleet. Owing to the slowness of certain auxiliary craft, the necessity for economizing fuel, and the mistiness of the weather at this time of year, which in these southern latitudes is winter, the speed of the fleet was never more than 10 knots, and at times fell below that figure. The target offered by such a long procession of ships, numbering at this stage 170 units, was therefore a tempting one. But, on the other hand, It must be remembered that low visibility has its disadvantages for an attacking submarine. 2 days earlier, the Japanese boats I-58 and I-53 had taken their station at a point of vantage near Shawl Bay, where the Cockburn Channel leads out from the Magellan Straits into the Pacific. Here they were in a position to deliver an attack upon the American fleet irrespective of the route it might elect to follow. They had been kept closely advised of the fleet's movements by the Japanese vice-consul at Punta Arenas, whose fast motor launch was busily engaged in maintaining communication with the submarines during their vigil. Apparently, it was considered too dangerous to employ radio signals for this purpose, lest the suspicions of the Chilean authorities should be aroused. At Punta Arenas, the fleet made a stay of 24 hours in order to refill bunkers from the accompanying colliers and oilers, as well as from ships which had been specially chartered to deliver fuel at this stage of the voyage. Provisional arrangements were also entered into for the engagement of local pilots in case it should be decided to follow the route through Smythe Channel. Reference must now be made to a factor which was to prove of considerable importance. The cruiser Trenton, a vessel of 7,500 tons displacement and over 33 knots speed, had been temporarily detached from the fleet on reaching the entrance to the straits. She had proceeded southward through the Strait of Le Maire and round Cape Horn, where she encountered heavy weather, which was scarcely felt by the fleet in the shelter of the straits. Her orders were to rejoin the flag by way of Cockburn Channel, the admiral proposing to decide, according to the nature of her report on weather conditions in the Pacific, whether or not to take the somewhat longer and more exposed route via Cockburn Channel and the open sea. In pursuance of these instructions, the Trenton passed eastward through Cockburn Channel and in due course reached Shawl Bay, where she awaited the arrival of the fleet from Punta Arenas. In this spot, the mist, which had been drifting across the straits in scattered patches, seems to have perceptibly thickened on the morning of August 9th. After a couple of hours, as it showed no signs of clearing, Captain Soames of the Trenton ordered one of his 2 airplanes to go aloft and report whether the fleet was in sight. Owing to damage to aerials sustained in the heavy weather of the preceding day, the Trenton's radio apparatus does not appear to have been in a condition to dispatch messages at this juncture. In the meantime, the sudden appearance of the cruiser from an unexpected direction had seriously perturbed the commanders of the 2 lurking submarines. They could not understand what object the Trenton could have in remaining at this spot in particular, and began to suspect that their existence might somehow have become known to the American admiral. If this were so, he might not intend to take his fleet further until he was satisfied that the route was clear. In such a contingency as this, they found it difficult to decide on the right course to pursue, since it does not appear to have been covered by their instructions. Like other men of action under similar circumstances, they could not reconcile it with their sense of duty to remain inactive, but they hesitated to forsake the carefully chosen point of vantage which they occupied at the mouth of Shawl Bay. As a compromise, they divided forces, I-53 remaining to watch the Trenton at Shawl Bay, while I-58 proceeded up the straits towards Punta Arenas to ascertain the whereabouts of the United States fleet. Shortly afterwards, a seaplane ascended from the deck of the Trenton, and rising to a height sufficient to keep above the low-lying mist banks, flew away to the northward. Close to Cape Froward, she came over a comparatively clear patch of water, where her observer, Lieutenant Merton, who had undergone a special course of instruction in anti-submarine operations, discerned the track of I-58 proceeding in the same direction as the airplane. After directing the pilot's attention to the phenomenon and confirming its existence by circling over the spot once or twice, speed was increased to over 150 miles an hour, and contact with the approaching fleet was quickly obtained. The alarming intelligence of the hostile submarine's presence was at once communicated to Admiral Templeton, by whose direction the entire fleet, with the exception of the destroyers and the light cruisers Birmingham and Chester, turned 16 points and retraced their course in the direction of Punta Arenas, which they had left an hour earlier. Unfortunately, in the course of this evolution, the collier Ajax, whose steering gear had been giving trouble for some days previously, failed to answer her helm and fell aboard the battleship Utah in the parallel column. In a vain attempt to avoid ramming the Ajax, the Utah reversed her engines with such suddenness that her next astern, the battleship Florida, which failed to perceive what had happened owing to the poor visibility, did not stop her engines in time, and struck the Utah's starboard quarter with great violence, opening a large rent on the waterline. For a couple of minutes the three ships remained locked together, much damage being done to upper works before they drew clear. And it was only by skillful maneuvering on the part of the other ships in the third squadron that further collisions were avoided. Of the three vessels involved, the unlucky Ajax was in the worst case. She had been badly holed in the engine room, and it soon became apparent that it would be impossible to save her, as her list became more and more pronounced. All hands were taken off, and she sank inside half an hour, the steep cliffs with deep water alongside rendering it impossible to beach her. The damage to the Utah, though less severe, might also have proved fatal had it occurred in bad weather or far from port. As it was, her powerful pumping installation was fully taxed to control the inrush of water from the flooded compartments, the shock of the collision, in spite of her stout construction, having started the bulkheads in the vicinity of the leak. She was able to reach Punta Arenas under her own steam, and with the assistance of harbor tugs was berthed alongside the quay at a spot where the water was sufficiently shallow to prevent her becoming completely submerged. Here it may be remarked that the skilled personnel of the repair ship Vestal, with the aid of local contractors and salvage plant, were able to prepare and fit a temporary patch which enabled the battleship eventually to complete her voyage. The Florida, though leaking slightly forward, had not damaged her bows to an extent affecting her seaworthiness, and she was able to remain with the fleet. Had the Japanese submarine been at hand when the collision occurred, she could scarcely have hoped for a more favorable opportunity of delivering an attack. But she was too far distant, and indeed was soon sufficiently occupied with the problem of her own safety. The destroyer flotillas, numbering 90 boats, 6 having remained with the Utah, and led by the Birmingham and Chester, were not long in locating I-58, to whose lair they were guided by the Trenton's plane and other aircraft sent up by the fleet. Numerous depth charges were dropped without immediate effect, but in a hunt by such a swarm of swift vessels, the odds were heavily against the submarine, which sealed her doom by steering an underwater course which took her into Useless Bay. Here she was sighted by seaplanes, and her retreat being cut off by the pursuing destroyers, she was forced to the surface in a crippled condition after depth charges had been dropped all around her. The concentrated gunfire of the destroyers quickly completed her destruction, and her shattered hull sank without having exhibited any sign of surrender. So far as could be ascertained, she discharged 2 torpedoes in the course of the hunt, neither of which took effect. When the report of her destruction reached Tokyo, it was embodied in a much magnified account of her exploits by the vernacular press, which credited the sinking of the Ajax and damaging of the Utah and Florida to her torpedoes. Doubtless Japanese official circles were better informed, but color was given to these and other exaggerated reports by the posthumous promotion and decoration of the officers and men who were lost in the submarine. In the meantime, the Trenton, in obedience to instructions by radio, had rejoined the destroyer flotillas, without any suspicion that another Japanese submarine was in hiding near her rendezvous at Shawl Bay. The rest of the day was occupied in reforming the fleet and making arrangements for the safety and repair of the Utah. Next morning, the voyage was resumed, the fleet steaming in practically the same order as before, with the Trenton in the van division. Admiral Templeton had determined, in spite of the Trenton's unfavorable report on the weather in the Pacific, to proceed via Cockburn Channel, his decision being strengthened by the knowledge that the shorter route through the Straits afforded many more opportunities for submarine attack. The fleet had passed Cape Froward and was bearing up to enter the Cockburn Channel when 2 torpedoes exploded in rapid succession, the first striking the transport Mount Evans in the starboard column of the second squadron, the second, the oiler Trinity, in the port column. There is no doubt both were intended for the battleships of the center column, as the track of the second torpedo was seen from the battleship Arkansas, and barely avoided by prompt use of the helm. In accordance with orders already circulated in readiness for such an emergency, all ships began zigzagging, at the same time increasing speed to their utmost capacity, while the destroyers, interposing themselves between the major vessels and the quarter from which the torpedoes had appeared to come, commenced to search for the source of this fresh attack, assisted by aircraft as before. One of the first to proceed to the assistance of the two stricken vessels was the Trenton, which had been rear ship in the first squadron. As she slowed up on approaching the Trinity, her long broadside of 550 feet was probably the best target within reach of I-53, for the great cruiser was immediately struck by two torpedoes amidships and had to run for Shawl Bay. But her stokehold fires were extinguished by the rising water before she could be beached, and the nearest destroyers had a busy time rescuing her crew as she settled down. The sinking of this cruiser was the crowning achievement of the Japanese submarines, which were unable to attempt any further coup. For some hours, the surrounding area was searched by aircraft and destroyers, but it was still very misty, and no trace could be found of the submarine, which was probably lying quietly on the bed of the straits, as microphones gave no clue to her movements. Meanwhile, the Mount Evans had foundered, but the Trinity, taken in tow by a couple of minesweepers, eventually struggled into Punta Arenas, badly down by the head. This Chilean port reaped quite a harvest in the way of repair work and other business as a result of the American fleet's misadventures. Determined to stamp out the submarine menace in the Straits, Admiral Templeton ordered 4 divisions of destroyers, with the Birmingham to remain in those waters and continue the hunt, while the remainder of the fleet proceeded up the Chilean coast, keeping well away from the land until they reached Valparaiso. The strongest representations were made by the U.S. minister at Santiago as to the misuse of Chilean territorial waters by the Japanese. The local authorities, with whom this had been a tender subject ever since the Germans had taken similar liberties in 1914-15, willingly responded by sending a number of warships south with orders to deal stringently with any Japanese submarine or other belligerent vessel found committing a breach of neutrality. The first result of this policy was that the Japanese vice-consul at Punta Arenas was restricted from using his motor launch except for harbor purposes, and this measure, no doubt, contributed to the ultimate rounding up of I-53. 10 days later, she was surprised in a remote inlet of the Straits, near the southern end of Santa Ynez Island, by a couple of Chilean destroyers, and forced to surrender under threat of being fired upon. She was in no condition to submerge, as she had been aground a short time previously, and had badly strained her hull and damaged her hydroplanes. Under escort of the Chilean destroyers, and with an armed guard on board, she was taken to Talcahuano and there interned. This inglorious end to her operations so preyed upon the mind of her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Yamaoka, that he committed harakiri some days afterwards, in spite of the fact that he had been notified through the Japanese minister that his conduct in sinking 2 American ships and crippling a third was regarded with approbation by his superiors. A good deal could be written about the operations of the American flotilla detailed to search the Straits. Before I-53 was found, they had explored the labyrinth of channels which the sea has made in the South American mainland, and through the innumerable islands adjacent to it between the 50th parallel and Cape Horn. Each division of 6 destroyers was assigned a definite area which they covered in as short a time as possible, according to the number of possible hiding places which it contained. Those inlets where the water was comparatively shallow were left untouched, since it was obvious that no submarine could find safety in them. The remainder of the fleet's voyage to Panama and San Diego was comparatively uneventful, the main portion reaching the latter port on September 9th. After their long voyage, several ships required to be overhauled and to have sundry defects made good, and to relieve the strain upon the resources of San Diego, Some units were ordered to Mare Island and Bremerton for repair. Altogether, it was nearly a month before everything had been dealt with, and even then the Utah's repairs were still outstanding. As the Panama Canal was reopened at the end of September, the only positive gain from the voyage was the training and seamanship which it imparted to the raw crews of Admiral Templeton's fleet. The effects of the Magellan Straits affair upon the two countries concerned differed somewhat. In Japan, the carefully edited accounts given by the newspapers intensified the enthusiasm evoked by the raids upon the American seaboard, and the suicide of Lieutenant Commander Yamaoka excited this to fever heat. Together with Lieutenant Commander Kuroi of I-58, he was made the object of a display of hero worship, which the government were not slow to turn to account. In the United States, on the other hand, the public regarded the incident with less complacency. Some were inclined to criticize the arrangements made by the Navy Department and by Admiral Templeton, while others refused to hear a word against the admiral, contending that he had shown skill and ability in extricating his command from what might have been a serious disaster. On the whole, however, the result was to strengthen the hands of the government in instituting a limited censorship over details published in the newspapers of naval movements. It was pointed out with justice that the frequent reports of the progress of the voyage which had appeared in print must have been of material assistance to the Japanese in making arrangements to intercept the fleet in the Magellan Straits. From the purely objective standpoint, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the Japanese deserved better luck. They had taken every precaution to ensure that their ambush should be laid at the right moment and in the most favorable place without arousing any suspicion of their intention, and only the fortuitous circumstances that led to I-58 being spotted from the air prevented the two submarines from delivering their attack together, without any previous warning. Lieutenant Commander Yamaoka of I-53 certainly handled his boat with the greatest skill. His ultimate internment was not surprising and was probably foreseen by the Japanese naval staff, from the remarks on the subject appearing in their official history. As regards the actual setting of the ambush, it may be suggested that more than 2 submarines might have been employed. But in view of all the conditions, it is reasonable to conclude that 2 was the ideal number. Any force in excess of that would have increased out of all proportion the risks of premature detection, quite apart from the question of the number of suitable craft which the Japanese had at their disposal. So far as the American arrangements were concerned, the Navy Department cannot be absolved from blame, in that they should at least have considered the possibility of the enemy attempting something of the kind, and either framed plans for dealing with it, or allowed Admiral Templeton more discretion in laying down the route to be followed. By his instructions, he was bound to call at Punta Arenas, and it is to his credit that he gave what proved an all-important order to the Trenton to proceed round the Horn and rendezvous at Shoal Bay, and so saved his command from what probably would have been a serious reverse.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.